Hello everyone, Coach Robert here with the very first video in my endgame repertoire series. Technically this is like a precursor because in my endgame repertoire series I plan to look at entire games that are instructive for the endgame, where you are guided into the endgame that is instructive from the very beginning. But I think it's important to cover some essentials first. And in this video I plan to make it very simple to assess what is going on in situations where you have a single pawn and you need to win the game. So I've arranged a series of examples that go in order from best possible situation to worst possible situation. I've sort of excluded the situations that are not very interesting, where, for example, their king is in the corner and you're about to promote. I've picked examples where it's interesting because the king is nearly in a good position. A good position for the defending side means the king is in front of the pawn, it's blocking its path, it makes it difficult for you to make progress. That is the ideal situation for the defending side. So if you find yourself in the situation of black in this diagram, it's very easy. You just want to keep your king in front of that pawn. You hang on for dear life. With white, it's more interesting. So let's see this first example. I consider this the best possible scenario because it is winning no matter whose turn it is. It turns out that this is not necessarily the case in any position. Sometimes if it's white's move, they get a draw, and sometimes it's not true. So in this one, it doesn't matter. So if you want, you can pause the video here and see if we can figure out the winning sequence for white. But I'll tell you right now, it's like this. We want to move the pawn first. This is generally not the case that you should always push your pawns. This is a very common mistake in the king and pawn endgame. But to illustrate why we're starting with the pawn, let's just think about how we need to make progress. The ideal situation here for white is one where their king is on either f7 or d7. Why these squares? The reason is that if you stand on one of these squares and your pawn begins to advance, your king is in an ideal situation to guard the promotion square and the steps leading up to it. I sometimes would call this the red carpet position when I was still coaching a lot. It's like the king is escorting the pawn to become a queen, and it does it best on these sides. Of course, we need to get there without losing our pawn on the way, so let's see how that happens. We would like to just run and get our king there, but this black king is in the way. These are our paths to reach these ideal squares. The black king covers all of them. But if you imagine this position with black to play, you would see that they're forced to make a concession. I also used to use this idea of chess football when I was teaching. Of course, American football, where we're pushing and shoving each other. If the king goes to this side, they are controlling this square and this square still, but not this one. This means that the white king will be able to advance this way. If the king goes this way, it's the same problem, but it's mirror image. So the ideal situation here is actually for white to make it black's turn. And since black has no other pieces, and this is a very important detail, they have to give ground. So if we did something like this, it is actually not effective the way we would like it to be. If you want, you could pause here and ask yourself what is the best defensive move for black, because people who are around the rating range below 1,000, they'll often mess up even this situation. The ideal defense is always to step and block the king from advancing. This is the ideal defensive stance. We always want to make it so that they cannot easily get onto these ideal squares. And if white pushes the pawn at this moment, this is also relatively easy. We still don't want to allow the king to advance, so we can only play this move. So this is the defensive thing for black. You should never run away from the white king and the pawn needlessly, because you want to keep a firm defensive stance. So when we play e3, black is in a pickle because they cannot play this waiting game. When they go here, the white king advances like this, and you see they're getting closer to their end goal, which doesn't matter if they can't ultimately reach there, but it turns out there's a iterable algorithm that you can follow, a sequence of moves that you can do over and over again that will always get you to the place you want to be. So pay attention to this. If the king comes forward, this is actually the easiest thing for white. Now we can start pushing our pawn, because if they try to run back to get in front of the pawn again, we can actually attain our best position with the king immediately. The reason we start with the pawn is that if we play this move, we actually draw on the spot. they're going to go and win our pawn. So we shouldn't do that. We have to start with the pawn move, but we still ultimately want to get onto one of these really good squares. This is a repeating theme in the king and one pawn versus king situation, even in the different versions of it. And it also applies in many more complicated endgames, which is why I want to show it at this early stage in a simple form. Now backing up, after king d5, they should not play king f5. That's a bad move. If you want, you can pause the video here and ask yourself, what is the best defensive try for black? You should be able to defend positions like this against weaker players, so this is important, even though it might seem silly. Again, we want to be as close to the white king as possible, preventing them from going to their best squares. This is the situation that is best for black, even though it's not a great situation overall. And it's not too late for white to mess up. You might want to pause here and ask yourself how you can make progress. Don't forget, you want your king to reach one of these good squares, but we also don't want to lose our pawn in the process. The best way forward is with king e5. And you might notice when you compare this diagram with the first one that we've managed to move this situation, which we said is a win no matter whose move it is, up the board by one file. So this position of the white of the two kings and the pawn, if you move it to any area on the board except maybe the very edge, you are going to have yourself a very good situation. Whenever the king is 2 steps in front of the pawn, they should be winning. So if we can maintain that situation and advance further, we should be able to eventually promote. So after king e5, they have the same dilemma. They might dodge this way. It doesn't really matter. We're going to make steady progress towards the square we want to go to. Again, we can take opposition. And eventually they're going to have to get out of our way and allow us to start rolling this pawn down. It's technically not precise to immediately occupy d7 because they have this annoying moment where they're threatening king e5 and we have to come back anyway. But I usually will teach this sequence because it's very conceptually easy to remember. We bring our king to this great square, the position's winning. As long as we don't lose the pawn, at this moment we should be able to win the whole thing. Technically here you might want to advance your pawn 1 step and then, keep going. But you get the idea. Eventually they're going to have to try to get in front of the pawn again. And when they do, we take the opposition. This is what it's called, opposition. When the kings are facing each other, there's only one square in the middle, and it's their turn. That's the situation where they have to give some ground. That's the chess football situation. They go here, we go here. If they go here, we go here. So that's how the game will typically end. With the red carpet, the king is escorting the pawn to become a queen. So it's a long sequence, but it's not really a complicated sequence. And it's very important to remember because it's so fundamental to how we play chess, especially when you only have a pawn advantage early in the game. You want to ideally trade into some situation like this, or better, something better than this. Okay, so this is the best possible situation for the attacking side. This, I would say, is the second best, if we had to just classify everything. If you want, you could pause here and decide whose move does it have to be to win. In the last diagram, we saw that the better side was winning no matter what. What about this one? In this situation, white is able to win if it's black's turn, not white's turn. That's maybe a counterintuitive thing, because usually you think when I want to do something, it needs to be my move. But actually, this is again our chess football situation, or the opposition. They need to stop us from making progress, but it's their turn, so they have to go up ground. If it was white's turn here, we would end up in a shuffle, where I go to this side, you go to this side. I go back, you go back. It doesn't really matter. And whenever they push the pawn, you get in front of that pawn. Now here's a very important defensive technique. Whenever you find yourself in this situation, you can't shuffle anymore. You have to step back. But which way do we step back? It turns out that there's a best answer. So you might want to pause here and see if you can figure out which of these retreating moves, I was trying to draw an arrow, which of these 3 retreating moves do we want to play? It turns out that you should always step directly back. I think this is an easy way to remember. If you have to step back, always step directly back. Straight back towards the edge of the board. Do not go on the diagonals, because there's always a risk that they will take the opposition. For instance, here if I play this move, you can see that the move king f5 takes the opposition. and that is not always a good thing. So we should step directly back. And now whenever they advance, we are able to take the opposition ourselves. In the last century, many people seem to believe that opposition was the most important endgame strategy. And it's very important, but it's far from everything. One thing that makes the concept of the opposition very powerful is that it is both the means of improving your position with the winning side and holding your defensive stance with the defending side. So opposition is quite useful in king and one pawn scenarios. This will eventually end in a draw. And you have your choice of draw. Following this algorithm where you step back every time and you block the king every time, don't go this way because they can occupy their best square. Remember, these are the really important squares, the ones that are just to the side in front of the pawn. You have to block the king, but eventually we reach a situation where the only thing they can do is shuffle their king, which would lead to some kind of repetition, something like that. I was just making random king moves there, but you know, it'll be some kind of repetition where you're always stepping back from the pawn, you're blocking the pawn whenever you have a chance. Anyway, but eventually, after all this shuffling occurs, you are going to have to push the pawn. And when the king steps in front of the pawn, you have no choice but to give stalemate, meaning the king has no place to go whatsoever, completely trapped. Or you have to give up the pawn, which is another kind of draw by insufficient material. So in this starting position, which is only one move different, right? The pawn is on e3 already, it's not on e2. In this situation, when the pawn doesn't have any extra moves, black has to be on the move in order for white to win. They need to be able to gain access to further territory, get onto these optimal squares. And this connects with the first diagram, because in the first one you can see that whenever you have extra moves with the pawn, you can create a winning situation no matter what, because if you don't like that it's your turn, you can make it their turn, like this. And if it's your turn, and if it's their turn in the first place, you can make your king advance to control the important squares. So that's the logical connection between this one, where you're more flexible because you have more pawn moves, and this one, where you're less flexible because you have fewer pawn moves. Now let's see some positions that are drawn. It's also important to know the drawn situations. And you should remember the result of each of these diagrams first and foremost. You should practice the technique afterwards, but already just knowing the result will help you, because when you're calculating down a long line and it ends in a position like this, you should be able to recognize right away if it's a win or a draw without calculating the whole pawn endgame. That's not efficient. So this one is a draw, and the logic behind it is actually quite simple. We don't even have to play it out or calculate or solve any puzzles here. Just compare it with this position. We found that from this diagram, even though it's our move, the best we can do is move the king out of the way and then advance our pawn. You can see that this is exactly the same position in our next diagram. So if the position with the pawn behind the king is a draw, why would it be a win with the pawn next to the king? This is already the position deteriorating, and it doesn't matter whose move it is. This position is also easy to understand by relating it to the previous one, because the king has to lead the way to go take control of the important squares. The king is the most powerful piece in this situation. If the king is behind the pawn and easily blockaded, why would this be a win? This is a draw no matter what. Black could step up and blockade the pawn now, and the only moves that white can make that improve the position transpose to the last diagram that we saw. So this is how we start to build our repertoire, where we see the interconnectedness of a variety of endgame positions. There's also an exception that's worth knowing. This position looks a lot like the situation where the better side wins with the opposition. The exception is good news. If your king is on the 6th rank, you win no matter what. Here, if we move to the side, meaning that we don't have the opposition, let's analyze black's options. They can play king d8, which is our prescribed technique. We usually want to step in front of the king, prevent it from advancing. But now if we just kind of count a couple moves ahead and see, are we getting a stalemate here with black? The answer is no, because the move e7 creates an exception. It prevents you from making your best defensive move. If it was white to play, they would stalemate here. They would have to play king e6, but this is not true. Black's king has to go here, and now we're going to get our queen. We have that red carpet position in hand. So king on the 6th wins even if it's white to play. And just to prove it to you, if it's black to play, they don't have a pleasant choice here. This is already the situation where the king is on the optimal square, the red carpet awaits, the pawn is becoming a queen. There's also the exception of the rook pawn, and I can just set up that diagram real quick for you guys. Let me make sure that that showed up properly. Yes. So in this situation, it doesn't really matter what white does or what black does. If the king is able to get into the corner in front of the pawn, there's no way to force it out, because if we compare with the ending of this diagram, the king got squeezed out. You see that? They had to go here, and that was bad for them. But in this diagram, how's that ever going to happen, right? We could run up. We can get a lot of progress because we have full control of the board. But eventually we're going to get a situation where we would really like to make them play for like king to I7, but I7 doesn't exist. Therefore, we're not able to make any further progress, even if it was black's move in this situation. So this is my short spiel on the very, very most basic and interrelated pawn and king situations against lone king. And this will hopefully prepare you guys for the rest of my endgame repertoire series, which will be a little bit more advanced than this. So I hope you like that, and feel free to subscribe and stuff like that if you want, of course. All right, take care. Good luck with your chess.